Good evening, and welcome to another video lesson. Tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the work of literary elements, in particular how they function in the telling of a linear narrative. Narratives we discussed in the previous video being the academic term for stories, and a linear narrative being a narrative that follows a straight line, beginning, middle, and end. Okay, what you see here is the structure, the skeleton of a linear narrative. As you can see, it follows beginning, middle, and end, and it has basic components that I talked about in the last video that create the entirety of the story. All that ends up ever changing is the details. As you can see in the first half of the story, we have the exposition, which typically takes up about the first 1 to 3 paragraphs. We have the initial conflict, which gets the story going, and we have the addition of extra characters. Focusing first on the exposition is composed of a great deal of imagery. Imagery is all of that language that the author uses to make the story become more realistic, to make it actually create pictures and images in your mind. Your sensory details are captivated by that use of imagery. In the use of imagery, the author is setting the tone, creating the setting, and developing our first understandings of the protagonist. These things are essential in the story in order that we become in the correct frame of reference to accept what the author's trying to tell us. Okay, in the exposition, let's first start with tone. Tone comes about through the author's use of imagery, and it creates the atmosphere for the story. It gives us an emotional feeling for what is happening and what it's about to be like. It could be very suspenseful, it could be scary, it could be really exciting, but all of the descriptive details through imagery build us up to feel as if we understand what's happening. The author's development of setting in the story is very important to us as readers and equally important to the character. The character exists within a setting, that time, place, and culture, that environment. Whether they're equipped for the environment, whether they're used to it, whether it's part of their experience in their life, is also important to understand. A character who's very much at home in one setting is going to do certain things. A character placed in an unfamiliar setting is likely to experience new things and change. Additionally, the setting creates what we can expect can and cannot happen. We develop an understanding of what the character will face because we have some understanding of that time and place and culture. So setting is relatively important in the exposition. It builds our expectations. Setting has the ability to set up some really interesting twists or some circumstances which a character will have to face. We see comedies where a modern person goes back in time and they seem as if a wizard or magician because the setting is so out of place for the character. Additionally, stories of survival, often involving people who have never had to deal with the wilderness, are suddenly faced with this life and death situation because, again, the setting is out of their context. Each of these things becomes important to the dynamics of the story, so understanding the setting and the whole background of that setting is very important to understand what the character is going to go through. Finally, in the exposition is the development or the introduction of the protagonist. The protagonist is the main character. It doesn't really matter if they're a good person or a bad person. It is important, however, that we understand what kind of person, what kind of character they are, and what they represent. We look for things that we would use to describe them as if they're real. Their gender, their age, etc. but also their behavior, their attitudes, their beliefs and values, what motivates them. Those types of things are also characterization. Characterization is all of the details an author uses to create a lifelike or realistic character. Importantly, in understanding who the protagonist is understanding where they start. Because where they start will set them up for how they're going to handle situations. It's important to track whether or not they change over the course of the story, because if they change, that change leads us to understand any of the major concepts the author was trying to teach us. Okay, now that we have the exposition kind of under control, we've read the beginning of the story, and we can understand tone, setting, and the protagonist, the story moves forward. What is it that moves the story forward? Well, it's an initial conflict, and typically, an initial conflict is internal. It is a problem that the protagonist is dealing with, either with their own identity, man versus self, or with their place in their society, aptly, man versus society. Regardless of which it is, there has to be something that takes our hero in a far, far away land and he does something. So that's the next step. What is it that is causing a problem for our protagonist? The next major section of our plot is the addition of extra characters. This may have come a bit earlier, it may be intermixed with the exposition, but at some point in the story, after the story gets moving forward, more characters are bound to show up. They're divided into two categories. There will be characters that are that support the protagonist, and they interact with them in positive ways, either to build them up or to criticize them in a way that causes the protagonist to become a better person than they were. That's an option as well. The other type of additional characters that show up are the various antagonists. Antagonists don't necessarily have to be characters in a man versus nature type of story. Nature itself could be the antagonist, but the antagonist is any character or force that gets in the way, tries to prevent, or tries to destroy the protagonist. These characters are very important because they provide the action and interaction that a protagonist needs on their journey in order to grow or change or face the circumstances the author seeks to put them in. Additionally, these other characters provide us with a comparison to our protagonist. It helps us classify the quality of our protagonist, or the qualities. The remainder of the story is developed through the author's creation of complications and conflicts that the protagonist must face. It is through these things that the protagonist is tested, and they will either rise to the occasion and grow and change and mature, or they will fail, and in their failure, they will suffer or be destroyed. Two types of conflicts that are particularly important at this time happen to be man versus man, those physical and verbal altercations between characters, and man versus nature, where a character actually must face either the natural elements and survive, or just the basic premises of a natural biological life. It is through all of these things that the story is expanded. It is complicated. It is made more intricate. And it is important to see how the protagonist faces each of these new conflicts and what it does to their character. Does it improve them, or does it degrade them? Either way, facing these conflicts is important. So noticing the conflicts throughout the story is significant for you as a reader. The second half of the linear narrative is comprised of a major obstacle, sometimes it's more than one, the climax, the turning point of the story, and the story's resolution, where everything kind of comes to an end. Each of these is very important because they cause the protagonist to change. Either for the better or for the worse, it is the second half of the narrative where the plot has more action, where it becomes more intense, and where the actions have more of an impact on the protagonist. Everything that happens in the second half of the story directly affects the protagonist and what they see as far as themselves and the world. As the narrative progresses past the halfway point, the protagonist faces more and more conflicts. Typically, they're outward conflicts. This expands the story, makes things more interesting, increases the amount of action, but eventually leads the protagonist to the major obstacle of the story. This major obstacle could be physical, could be emotional, could be against nature, depending on those things. It depends on the type of conflict, but it becomes a major challenge that the protagonist must face in order to become the person they're supposed to become based on the author's wishes. This moment presents a challenge, the challenge, for the protagonist. They have to decide what they're made of, what they really believe in, what they stand for, and it brings about the fundamental aspect of their character that we should come to understand. This major obstacle forces our protagonist to make some really tough decisions. And in making those decisions, they have to come to terms with some of the realities about themselves and about life. They really have to take a stand. And then it leads into the climax rather importantly. Yes, that was a student. That way. Where the major obstacle is the big thing that forces the character to consider themselves and to make a decision about what they need to do. The climax is actually what they end up doing. The major obstacle deals with what they face. The climax of the story is the moment they actually face it. The climax is the most intense point in the story, and it can also be the turning point. This is the moment you have to pay attention to what happens to the protagonist, to the character. Being the turning point, the outcome of the climax is what is going to lead you to understand about the theme. It brings us the resolution of the story happens after the moment of the climax. All of the details from the end of the climax to the end of the story is the resolution. We look for things that are different from the beginning of the story. We start to compare the beginning and the end. We look for changes in tone, in character, in setting, and we evaluate where the characters started, what they've been through, and where they ended up. Once we can deal with that, and we can look at the protagonist and what they've faced, and how they've changed or grown, whether they've gotten better or whether they've gotten worse, whether they've succeeded or whether they've been destroyed like in Macbeth, it is the outcome of the story, it is the resolution that allows us to piece together the idea about life, about individuals, and about society that the author was trying to get at all along. It is what happens to the character in the climax and the resolution that brings us to theme. And theme is simply the major concept, or possibly major concepts, that the author hoped we would understand regarding ourselves, the nature of life, how society works, and the things we can and cannot control. That, in a nutshell, is a linear narrative. Thank you for joining me over the course of multiple days and multiple outfits. I hope this has helped. Review the video if you need to. Come to class with questions. What I ask you to do, please email me a brief summary of a story you've read that fits this structure.